Alia had always believed in the power of dreams. Even as a child, she would lie beneath the sprawling neem tree in her backyard, staring at the clouds drifting lazily across the sky, imagining herself traveling to distant cities, attending university, and making friends who understood her. Her mind was a world of possibilities, filled with laughter, curiosity, and hope. But in the narrow streets of her small town, dreams were considered luxuries. Duty and tradition outweighed personal ambition, and the desires of a young girl often came last. When her parents first told her that she would be married, Alia thought it was a temporary test of her patience. Perhaps, she reasoned, it was only a suggestion, something that could be delayed. But as the days passed, the reality crystallized. Her family had chosen a man for her, a man much older than herself, and there would be no debate. At 17, she was to leave the world she knew behind and enter a home dictated by another's rules. Fear and resentment churned inside her. How could she be expected to bind her life to a stranger? Someone whose face she had never studied, whose habits she had never known, whose touch she had never felt. She imagined him as a tyrant, a man with a rigid temper who would demand obedience and crush her spirit. At night, she cried quietly beneath her blanket, wishing for some miracle, some escape from the fate that seemed inevitable. The day she met him, Alia was ready for coldness, if not cruelty. The wedding was a blur of colors, ceremonial chants, and the mechanical steps of tradition. She had donned a heavy crimson dress, adorned with sequins and gold embroidery that pinched and scratched her skin. Her face was hidden beneath a veil, hiding her fear and her tears from the world. When the ceremony ended, she walked into the unfamiliar home with trembling steps, her heart a mixture of dread and defiance. Farid, her husband, was nothing like she had imagined. He was older, yes, with the faint lines of age tracing his face, and hair flecked with gray, but his eyes were calm and observant rather than stern. He did not demand her attention, nor did he speak with the brusqueness she had feared. Instead, he offered a polite nod and a quiet smile, as if acknowledging her presence without overwhelming it. Alia, accustomed to stern faces and rigid expectations, felt a flicker of confusion. Could someone so old and powerful in society's eyes really be gentle? The first days were suffocating in their silence. Alia tiptoed around the house, uncertain of her place, afraid of speaking out of turn. Farid kept to himself most of the time, reading, tending to his papers, or walking slowly through the garden. Yet, she noticed small gestures that confused her even more. A cup of tea left precisely where she could reach it, a gentle correction when she stumbled through a household task, a quiet question about her well-being that seemed almost too considerate to be real. She found herself observing him secretly, studying his mannerisms. He was disciplined, punctual, and precise, but he carried no arrogance or malice. He never raised his voice, and he never demanded submission beyond what was customary. It was as if he understood the delicate balance between tradition and compassion. These small acts of kindness stirred a strange feeling in her chest, one she hadn't allowed herself to recognize before, hope. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and cast golden light across the living room, Alia watched Farid tending to the garden from the window. His hands moved carefully over the soil, planting seeds with care and patience. She realized he treated even the smallest life with respect, and in that moment, she wondered if perhaps she had misjudged him entirely. Perhaps, she thought, there was more to him than age and appearances, more than she could see in the brief encounter of a wedding day. But fear lingered. Alia could not ignore the nagging thought that this kindness might be fleeting, that behind it lay the cold reality of a marriage she had not chosen. She reminded herself to remain cautious, to guard her heart. And yet, each small gesture, each gentle word, made her chest feel lighter, and a spark of trust began to grow where there had been only dread. Days turned into weeks, and Alia began to settle into a fragile rhythm in her new home. The fear that had clung to her like a second skin slowly loosened its grip. She still felt out of place, still struggled with the sense that she had been thrust into a life not of her choosing, but the subtle kindness of Farid made the adjustment slightly more bearable. He never demanded her attention, never imposed rules beyond what was necessary, and slowly, she realized that he was not the harsh tyrant she had imagined. Farid's quiet presence became a source of unexpected comfort. He rose every morning before dawn, performing his prayers with a meticulous devotion that struck Alia as both humbling and inspiring. Then he would tend the garden, his hands gentle on the soil, coaxing life from the earth with patience and care. She watched him sometimes from the window, noting the way he handled each plant as though it were delicate and irreplaceable. He spoke to the flowers, sometimes murmuring words she could not hear, but his voice held a softness that startled her. It was a side of him that no one else seemed to witness, a side that seemed almost tender. It was this quiet, unnoticed kindness that began to break through the walls around her heart. One afternoon, she tried speaking to him while he worked in the garden, her voice hesitant, almost shy. Do you like these flowers?" she asked, pointing to a row of marigolds she had been tending herself. Farid paused, a small smile tugging at his lips. "They're thriving," he said gently. "They remind me that care and attention can change almost anything." His words seemed simple, but to Alia, they carried weight. It was the first time someone in her new life had spoken to her not with authority, but with a measure of respect. Encouraged by this interaction, Alia began to speak more, to ask questions, to share fragments of her past. She told him about her childhood dreams, her love for reading, and her yearning to continue her education. Farid listened. He did not interrupt, did not dismiss her desires as frivolous or impractical. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully, as if weighing her words and considering their importance. Then, one evening, he made an offer that took her breath away. He would support her education. Tutors could come to the house, she could study in her own time, and her interests would not be curtailed by tradition or expectation. Alia felt a mixture of shock and disbelief. She had expected resentment, disinterest, perhaps even scorn, but instead, she was offered encouragement. For the first time, she realized that not all marriages were prisons, that sometimes, compassion could be more powerful than fear. She began to allow herself small moments of hope, though she kept them guarded, afraid that reality might crush them if she dared to be too open. The bond between them grew in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. He asked her opinion on small household matters, sought her thoughts on meals and decor, and occasionally, even invited her to accompany him on walks around the property. Laughter, once foreign in their home, became more frequent. He shared stories from his youth, of adventures he had dreamed of but never undertaken, and she found herself laughing at his dry humor, marveling at the way age could bring wisdom but also a playful lightness. One rainy evening, as the drops tapped rhythmically against the windows, Alia finally allowed herself to voice a deeper fear. "I miss my old life," she admitted quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the rain. "I miss my friends, school, freedom." Farid did not respond immediately. He listened, really listened, with a patience that took her by surprise. Then he spoke, his voice low and calm, but filled with sincerity. "I cannot bring back your past, Alia, but I can help you shape your future. Your dreams are not irrelevant, they are worth pursuing. I will not ask you to abandon them." The words struck her like a gentle wave, washing over the anxiety and despair that had dominated her days. Alia realized she was not alone in this strange new life. There was someone beside her who did not demand obedience or submission, but offered companionship, understanding, and, above all, respect. Days blended into months, and the walls that had enclosed her heart began to crumble. She discovered the subtle magic of small kindnesses, the way he remembered her favorite tea, the way he adjusted his schedule to accommodate her lessons, the way he praised her for even minor accomplishments. Farid's unexpected thoughtfulness became the soil in which Alia's confidence could grow. By the time a year had passed, she had not only adapted to her new life, she had begun to embrace it. The fear that had once dominated every thought had been replaced with cautious hope. She had entered the marriage as a frightened girl, convinced that her choices had been stolen, but she began to see that a life shaped by understanding and compassion could be fulfilling in ways she had never imagined. The months had rolled by gently, almost imperceptibly, yet in that quiet passage of time, Alia felt herself changing. The timid, fearful girl who had entered Farid's home was now replaced by someone who carried a quiet confidence. She spoke more freely, studied diligently, and even laughed more easily at the small joys that life offered. Farid had kept his promise, providing tutors and encouragement, never once diminishing her ambitions or questioning her abilities. What had started as obligation had gradually transformed into a life that, while unexpected, was beginning to feel like her own. Their relationship deepened in subtle, often unspoken ways. Farid continued his routines, rising early for prayer, tending his garden, and performing his work with disciplined care. But he also began to notice Alia in ways that felt tender and intentional. He would pause his work to ask how her lessons had gone, adjust the morning tea to her preferred strength, or silently sit beside her while she read, allowing her to share the quiet of the room with him. It was a companionship that neither demanded nor imposed, a balance that nurtured both their hearts. One evening, after a long day of study and writing, Alia found herself in the garden with Farid as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a warm, golden glow. She had brought a small book of poetry, one she had discovered months ago and had read to herself in secret. Now, emboldened by his presence and the gentle safety of their companionship, she began to read aloud. Farid listened silently, the corners of his mouth lifted in a small smile, the occasional nod marking his attention. He asked questions about the meanings of lines, encouraged her interpretations, and even offered his own insights, revealing layers of thoughtfulness she had not noticed before. The connection felt natural, like two people discovering a shared rhythm in the quietest of places. For the first time, she realized that this bond was not built on obligation or fear, it was growing from trust, respect, and a mutual desire to understand one another. One rainy night, as the drops drummed softly against the windows, Alia found the courage to speak her deepest truth. "I never imagined a marriage could be like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought it would be suffocating, controlling, but now, I feel alive, in a way I never expected." Farid looked at her with an intensity that made her heart flutter. "Alia," he said gently, "you bring life into this house. Not because it is your duty, but because you choose to. And I cannot imagine a life without your presence, without your thoughts, without your laughter." The words struck her, not as grand declarations of love, but as something more profound, an acknowledgement of her worth, her voice, her spirit. It was not the loud, fiery passion of novels or films, but something steadier, rooted in understanding and appreciation. And for the first time, Alia allowed herself to truly feel warmth for Farid, a spark of affection that had been quietly growing for months. Time continued to pass, and their lives intertwined more seamlessly. Alia's education flourished, her intellect expanding alongside her confidence. She began to dream again, not of escaping, but of building, a life in which she could honor her ambitions while nurturing the quiet, tender love that had developed between them. Farid, in turn, seemed to soften with her presence, finding joy in small acts of togetherness, shared meals, evening walks in the garden, and long conversations that stretched into the night. One afternoon, as they tended the garden together, planting the first blooms of spring, Alia paused and looked at Farid. The man she had once feared, whose age had seemed insurmountable, had become a partner, a confidant, and, in some ways, a mirror reflecting the best parts of herself. She realized that their relationship had grown far beyond what either could have anticipated. What had begun as a forced union had transformed into a partnership rooted in care, understanding, and a shared respect for life and for one another. "I never thought I could feel this way," she admitted softly, brushing soil from her hands. "I didn't want this marriage, but now, I can't imagine my life without you." Farid smiled, placing his hand lightly over hers. "Neither could I, Alia. Neither could I." It was a quiet declaration, yet it carried the weight of everything they had endured and learned together. The unexpected kindness of an older man had indeed changed everything. Alia understood now that love was not always a sudden spark. Sometimes, it was a slow, deliberate bloom, nurtured by patience, understanding, and small acts of consideration. As the sun set over the garden, casting long shadows across the earth, Alia felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had entered this marriage with fear and resentment, expecting a life of restriction and loneliness. Instead, she had discovered compassion, encouragement, and a love that had grown slowly but surely, transforming the life she had dreaded into one she could embrace fully.